There are nights when the wind does not just blow, it whispers. I remember those nights. I remember the silence that felt alive, the darkness that felt like it was watching me, and the power I thought was mine. I was not an ordinary man. I was a witch doctor. People traveled miles to find me. They came afraid and they left more afraid. They believed I could speak to spirits, control destinies, curse enemies, heal sickness. And sometimes things happened that no human strength could explain. But here is the truth no one knew. The deeper I went into darkness, the more darkness entered me. Power came at a price. Sleep left me. Peace abandoned me. And fear became my closest companion. Because when you serve darkness, darkness never serves you back. There was one night, different from the others. The air was heavy. The ritual fire would not rise. The spirits were silent. And in that strange silence, I heard a name, not chanted, not summoned, spoken softly inside my heart. Jesus. I tried to ignore it. I shouted louder incantations. I called on every spirit I had ever known. But instead of power, I felt trembling. And then I saw him. Not with these eyes, but with a clarity deeper than sight. Light. Not burning light, but living light. And in that light, I saw myself clearly for the first time. Not powerful, not feared, just lost. I expected anger, judgment, destruction. But instead, I felt love. A love stronger than every spell I had ever cast. A presence greater than every spirit I had ever invoked. And I realized something that shattered everything I believed. The spirits I served trembled at the name of Jesus. The power I thought was supreme was nothing before him. In that moment, I had a choice. Hold on to fear or surrender to love. I fell to my knees, not because I was forced, but because I was free for the first time. There was a time when I believed power was the highest treasure a human being could possess. Power to influence outcomes, power to speak and see events shift, power to command unseen forces and watch visible results unfold. From the outside, it looked impressive. People bowed their heads when I passed. They lowered their voices. They treated me as someone who stood between worlds. And in those moments, I mistook their fear for respect and their trembling for honor. What I did not understand then was that power, when separated from peace, is not freedom. It is bondage dressed in impressive clothing. Power without peace slowly consumes the one who carries it. At first, it feels intoxicating. There is a rush in knowing that others depend on you for solutions. There is a dangerous sweetness in being consulted before decisions are made. But behind that sweetness is a tightening grip. You begin to guard your position. You begin to suspect everyone. You cannot rest because rest feels like vulnerability. You cannot relax because you believe something may slip from your control. And so you stay alert, always listening, always watching, always calculating. That constant vigilance feels like strength, but it is a prison cell with invisible bars. Peace is the quiet assurance that you are safe even when you are not in control. When peace is absent, control becomes your survival strategy. You grip situations tightly. You manipulate outcomes. You overthink every interaction. You monitor the reactions of others. You build systems to protect your influence. And each layer of control adds weight to your spirit. You tell yourself you are maintaining order, but inside you are losing stillness. Your mind never quiets. Your heart never rests. You lie awake at night, replaying conversations, anticipating threats that may never come. This is bondage, though it looks like authority. There is a subtle transformation that occurs when power lacks peace. You begin to serve the very thing you believe you command. If your identity depends on being powerful, then you must constantly prove it. If your value depends on being feared, then you must constantly reinforce that fear. And so you make decisions not from wisdom, but from insecurity. You protect your image rather than your integrity. You react instead of respond. You intimidate instead of inspire. You isolate yourself because closeness feels like weakness. The irony is quiet but devastating. The one who appears strongest is often the most enslaved. Bondage does not always announce itself with chains and locks. Sometimes it whispers through anxiety. Sometimes it shows itself through the inability to be alone with your own thoughts. When your inner world is restless, no amount of outward authority can compensate. You may command rooms, but you cannot command your heartbeat to slow. You may influence others, but you cannot silence the unease that follows you into private spaces. And that unease grows louder in the quiet. It questions your stability. It exposes your fragility. It reminds you that power is fragile when it is not anchored in peace. True power does not need to shout. It does not need constant validation. It does not rely on fear to sustain itself. It is steady. It is composed. It is unthreatened by opposition. Peace allows power to be gentle. Without peace, power becomes harsh. It becomes defensive. It becomes suspicious. When a person has peace, they can afford to lose a position because their identity is not tied to status. When peace is present, surrender does not feel like annihilation. It feels like wisdom. But when peace is absent, surrender feels like death. And so the person fights endlessly, exhausting themselves to maintain an illusion. I once believed that if I controlled enough forces, learned enough secrets, mastered enough rituals, I would finally feel secure. But security built on control is unstable. It demands constant reinforcement. The more you gain, the more you fear losing. The higher you climb, the more terrifying the fall appears. This fear quietly governs your decisions. You begin to anticipate betrayal. You begin to interpret neutrality as hostility. You become hyper-aware of threats. And that constant alertness erodes your inner life. You may stand tall in public, but inside you are shrinking. Peace, on the other hand, allows you to release the illusion that you must orchestrate everything. It allows you to accept uncertainty without panic. It creates space in your mind. It slows your breathing. It softens your posture. It removes the urgency that screams you must act immediately or lose everything. And when peace is absent, urgency dominates. You rush decisions. You escalate conflicts. You overextend yourself. You take on more than you can carry because you believe stepping back will diminish you. But stepping back is sometimes the doorway to freedom. Power without peace also distorts relationships. When your foundation is fear, you relate to others through leverage rather than love. You measure what they can do for you or against you. You keep emotional distance because vulnerability feels dangerous. You may have followers, but you lack intimacy. You may have influence, but you lack connection. And in quiet moments, you feel the loneliness of someone who cannot be fully known. That loneliness deepens the bondage. It convinces you to hold tighter to power, believing it will compensate for the emptiness. But power cannot replace peace, and influence cannot replace wholeness. The second truth is closely woven into the first. Fear is the currency of darkness. Fear is the invisible energy that sustains systems of control. When fear enters the heart, it narrows perception. It magnifies threats and minimizes hope. It convinces you that survival depends on dominance. Darkness thrives where fear is normalized. If you can keep someone afraid, you can keep them compliant. If you can keep yourself afraid, you will remain trapped in cycles of overreaction and defensiveness. Fear has a rhythm. It starts as a whisper of caution, which can be healthy. But when it grows unchecked, it becomes a constant background noise. It colors your interpretation of events. A delayed response feels like rejection. A disagreement feels like rebellion. A mistake feels catastrophic. Your nervous system remains activated, as though danger is always near. And when you live in that state, your decisions are no longer guided by wisdom, but by survival instinct. You become reactive. You strike first to avoid being struck. You dominate conversations to avoid being silenced. You overcompensate to hide insecurity. Darkness uses fear strategically. It isolates individuals by convincing them that vulnerability will destroy them. It persuades them that admitting weakness invites attack. And so they build walls. They conceal struggles. They project confidence they do not feel. The performance becomes exhausting, but stepping out of it feels riskier than continuing. Fear tells you that if you loosen your grip, everything will collapse. It tells you that others are waiting for your downfall. It magnifies worst-case scenarios until they feel inevitable. Living under fear alters your body as much as your thoughts. Your shoulders tense, your jaw tightens, your sleep becomes shallow. Your mind replays possibilities long after the moment has passed. This physiological response reinforces the illusion of danger. The body signals alarm, and the mind searches for threats to justify it. The cycle continues. Darkness does not need dramatic manifestations to maintain influence. Sustained anxiety is sufficient. Chronic suspicion is sufficient. Internal unrest is sufficient. When fear becomes the currency of your decisions, you begin to trade peace for temporary security. You accept environments that keep you on edge because they promise control. You justify harshness because it maintains order. You silence compassion because it feels unsafe. But every transaction deepens the deficit of peace within you, and the more peace diminishes, the more fear dominates. It is a quiet exchange, almost unnoticeable at first. Yet over time, you realize that your world is structured around avoidance rather than trust. Educationally, it is important to recognize that fear activates the brain as survival centers. It narrows creative thinking and amplifies defensive patterns. In this state, long-term reasoning weakens. You focus on immediate relief rather than sustainable solutions. Darkness exploits this narrowing. When people are afraid, they are easier to control, easier to influence, easier to manipulate. Fear distorts perception so that even neutral situations appear hostile. This distortion keeps the mind occupied with imagined battles. Calm strength emerges when fear loses its authority. This does not mean danger disappears. It means the internal response shifts. Instead of reacting impulsively, you pause. Instead of escalating, you evaluate. Instead of assuming betrayal, you seek clarity. Peace interrupts the transaction of fear. It refuses to pay the price demanded by darkness. And when peace enters, fear begins to weaken because its currency is no longer accepted. The most suspensive realization is that many people who appear powerful are negotiating with fear behind closed doors. They maintain influence externally while battling insecurity internally. They command attention publicly while questioning their stability privately. Their lives become elaborate structures built to protect a fragile center. And until peace replaces fear at that center, bondage continues, quiet and persistent, beneath the surface of visible strength. There are names that echo through history as symbols, and there are names that function merely as labels. A label identifies, it distinguishes one person from another. But authority is something deeper. Authority is recognized, not enforced. It is not created by repetition, but revealed by response. When I first began to understand the authority carried in the name of Jesus, it was not through study or debate, it was through reaction. I observed how unseen forces responded when that name was spoken with sincerity. What years of ritual could not stabilize. A single invocation of that name unsettled. This is not mystical exaggeration. It is a psychological and spiritual reality that authority operates where recognition exists. Authority does not depend on volume. It does not need complex ceremonies to activate it. In environments saturated with ritual, I had been trained to believe that power required precision, timing, ingredients, posture, sequence. If one element failed, the result weakened. It was a system of maintenance. But the authority in the name of Jesus did not follow that pattern. It was not formula-driven. It did not require elaborate preparation. It functioned relationally rather than mechanically. That distinction is critical. Mechanical systems depend on technique. Relational authority depends on position. Educationally, authority is always tied to legitimacy. A police officer carries authority not because of personal strength, but because of recognized backing. A judge commands order not because of physical dominance, but because of lawful appointment. Authority flows from source. When the name of Jesus is spoken, it carries the weight of the one it represents. This is why reaction precedes explanation. In moments of fear, in moments of spiritual disturbance, in moments of internal chaos, The name can produce calm or confrontation without argument. Something deeper than psychology recognizes hierarchy. This does not imply superstition. It reveals alignment. The human mind is profoundly sensitive to meaning and identity. When a name embodies hope, sacrifice, restoration, and sovereignty, it carries psychological and spiritual resonance. Darkness, whether understood metaphorically as destructive patterns or spiritually as opposing forces' response to perceived threat. The authority of Jesus confronts destructive systems at their foundation because it does not negotiate with them. It does not attempt coexistence. It asserts order where disorder has settled. Suspense arises in recognizing that authority can be present even when comprehension is incomplete. Many people speak the name casually, unaware of its weight. Others avoid it because they sense that it demands something. Authority requires response. It invites surrender or resistance. It exposes allegiance. When that name enters a space internally or externally, it brings a kind of illumination. Patterns hidden in shadow begin to surface. Justifications weaken. Defensive structures tremble. This is not theatrical imagery. It is the quiet unraveling that occurs when truth is introduced into deception. Authority also simplifies. Where rituals complicate, authority clarifies. Where fear multiplies instructions, authority reduces confusion. In environments where I once relied on layers of incantation, the name of Jesus cut through complexity with startling directness. There was no bargaining, no exchange, no appeasement. Only declaration. This distinction is educationally significant because it reveals the difference between power pursued and authority possessed. Pursued power is anxious. Possessed authority is calm. The authority in the name of Jesus is not merely about dominance over darkness. It is about restoration of order. Authority establishes boundaries. It defines what has access and what does not. In a life governed by fear, boundaries are porous. Anxiety seeps in. Destructive habits infiltrate. Self-doubt occupies space it should not. Authority redraws those lines. It asserts that certain influences no longer have permission. This is why the name carries transformative potential. It reorients identity. It shifts allegiance. It declares that chaos does not have final say. Closely connected to authority is encounter. Encounter is greater than argument because argument appeals to intellect, while encounter engages the whole being. Arguments can be won while hearts remain unchanged. Debates can be sophisticated while lives remain fractured. Encounter bypasses defensive reasoning. It confronts the individual with experience. Educational systems often prioritize information transfer. Yet transformation frequently occurs through direct experience. I had heard discussions. I had listened to criticisms and defenses. None of them altered my direction. They stimulated thought, but did not penetrate conviction. It was encounter that destabilized my certainty. Encounter carries a dimension of undeniability. When a person experiences profound peace, where fear once dominated, or clarity where confusion ruled, explanation becomes secondary. The mind may later attempt to analyze, but the initial impact is holistic. Psychologically, encounter imprints memory differently than argument. Emotional intensity strengthens retention. A lived moment reshapes neural pathways more effectively than abstract theory. This is why transformative experiences often occur in crises or heightened states. The individual becomes aware of vulnerability, defenses thin. In that openness, encounter has room to operate. It is suspensive because it arrives unexpectedly. It interrupts routine. It confronts identity. Encounter does not eliminate questions. It reframes them. After encounter, inquiry shifts from skepticism to exploration. Instead of asking whether something is real, the individual begins asking what it means. This transition marks a profound change. Argument positions individuals on opposing sides. Encounter dissolves rigid positioning. It introduces humility. One realizes that understanding is incomplete. That realization can feel destabilizing, but it also creates space for growth. Educationally, it is important to distinguish between emotionalism and encounter. Emotionalism can be manufactured through atmosphere, music, group influence. Encounter, however, produces sustained change beyond the moment. It alters priorities. It shifts behavior patterns. It redefines identity. It does not rely on external stimulation to maintain itself. Instead, it plants conviction internally. There is also a quiet authority within encounter. When someone has genuinely experienced transformation, their testimony carries weight that argument cannot replicate. It is not aggressive. It does not demand agreement. It simply states what occurred. And that calm certainty can be unsettling to opposition because it is rooted in lived reality. One cannot easily dismantle experience with theory. Suspense lingers in recognizing that encounter often begins subtly. It may start as an internal stirring, an unexplained peace, an awareness of presence. It may intensify during moments of desperation or stillness. The individual senses that something is addressing them personally, not generically. This personalization distinguishes encounter from general inspiration. It feels directed, intentional, as though unseen eyes perceive what has been concealed. When authority and encounter converge, transformation accelerates. Authority establishes legitimacy. Encounter establishes intimacy. Together they dismantle systems built on fear. The name of Jesus asserts order. Encounter with Jesus reveals character. Authority commands. Encounter invites. This balance prevents distortion. Authority without encounter could appear harsh. Encounter without authority could feel sentimental. Combined, they produce reverent stability. There is educational value in understanding that argument alone rarely liberates someone entrenched in destructive systems. People defend identities they have invested in. Logic threatens ego structures. Encounter, however, exposes vulnerability without immediate confrontation. It allows truth to be felt before it is dissected. And once felt, it is difficult to dismiss entirely. Calm reflection reveals that authority recognized through encounter produces lasting peace. It does not depend on constant reinforcement. It does not require perpetual debate. It rests in assurance that what was experienced was authentic. Suspense remains because encounter continues unfolding implications long after the initial moment. Questions surface. Habits confront resistance. Allegiances shift gradually. Yet beneath the process lies a settled awareness that something irreversible has occurred. The most profound realization is that authority and encounter are accessible without elaborate mediation. They do not require secret knowledge. They do not demand intellectual superiority. They require openness. And openness can feel dangerous to someone accustomed to control. To open oneself is to risk exposure. But it is also to permit illumination. In that illumination, arguments lose urgency because reality has been personally touched, and the mind begins to reorganize itself around what the heart has already recognized. Power can be intoxicating long before it becomes destructive. It often begins as a solution to weakness. A person feels overlooked, uncertain, vulnerable to forces they cannot predict, and so they pursue strength. At first, this pursuit appears wise. Strength promises protection. Influence promises security. Control promises stability. But there is a subtle difference between strength rooted in peace and strength driven by unrest. When peace is absent, power becomes a shield against fear rather than an expression of wholeness. And what begins as protection slowly transforms into captivity. Power without peace is rarely recognized as bondage in its early stages. It feels productive. It feels purposeful. You learn how to influence outcomes. You develop the ability to shape environments. People respond to you. They listen. They hesitate before crossing you. Externally, these are signs of authority. Internally, however, something quieter is unfolding. The need to maintain that position begins to whisper. You start measuring conversations. You analyze tones. You interpret silence as threat. The mind remains alert even when no danger is present. This constant vigilance is not strength. It is strain. Peace allows a person to rest without fearing loss. Without peace, rest feels irresponsible. If you loosen your grip, you imagine collapse. If you trust others, you anticipate betrayal. If you admit limitation, you expect replacement. So you tighten control. You extend your reach. You overcompensate for potential weakness. Yet the more you expend your control, the more fragile you feel. This is the paradox of power without peace. The greater the outward influence, the deeper the inward insecurity. Educationally, peace is a stabilizing internal state that regulates thought and emotion. It enables long-term reasoning and measured response. When peace is absent, stress hormones remain elevated. Decision-making shifts from thoughtful evaluation to reactive defense. A person operating from unrest may appear decisive, but their choices are often driven by avoidance rather than clarity. They seek immediate assurance rather than sustainable wisdom. Over time, this reactive pattern becomes exhausting. The body carries tension. The mind cycles through scenarios. Sleep becomes shallow. Silence becomes uncomfortable. Bondage does not always involve visible chains. Sometimes it is the inability to disengage from control. Sometimes it is the fear of losing relevance. Sometimes it is the relentless need to prove superiority. A person may command attention in public and yet feel hollow in private. They may hold influence over others but lack mastery over their own thoughts. When peace is missing, the inner world becomes unstable, and no amount of external authority can compensate for internal chaos. Power that is not grounded in peace often isolates. It creates distance between the individual and others. Relationships become strategic rather than sincere. Trust becomes conditional. Vulnerability becomes dangerous. You reveal only what maintains advantage. Over time, this guarded posture reduces intimacy. You may be surrounded by people, yet profoundly alone. Loneliness deepens insecurity, and insecurity intensifies the drive for control. The cycle reinforces itself quietly, almost imperceptibly. There is also a moral dimension to power without peace. When fear governs the heart, ethical boundaries blur. You justify harshness because it secures compliance. You excuse manipulation because it prevents loss. You suppress empathy because compassion feels risky. In protecting your position, you begin sacrificing your integrity. Yet, each compromise unsettles the conscience. That unease accumulates. You silence it by exerting more control, but the silence is temporary. The unrest returns, often stronger than before. True power is calm. It does not rush. It does not panic. It does not perceive every disagreement as rebellion. Peace gives power its stability. Without peace, power becomes volatile. It swings between dominance and anxiety. It reacts sharply to minor challenges. It interprets neutrality as opposition. And because it is unstable, it demands constant reinforcement. The person must continuously assert authority to reassure themselves that they still possess it. This is bondage disguised as leadership. Closely intertwined with this is the reality that fear is the currency of darkness. Fear sustains systems that thrive on control. It narrows perception. It magnifies threats. It distorts interpretation. When fear enters the mind, it alters how information is processed. Neutral expression seems suspicious. Constructive criticism feels like attack. Delays feel like rejection. The mind searches for danger even when none is present. This hypervigilance reinforces stress responses and erodes peace further. Fear is powerful because it feels protective. It convinces you that constant alertness prevents harm. But sustained fear weakens discernment. It pushes the nervous system into survival mode. In survival mode, the goal is not wisdom but preservation. You act quickly, sometimes aggressively. You choose short-term security over long-term health. You resist vulnerability because exposure feels fatal. Darkness, whether understood as destructive patterns or spiritual opposition, thrives in this environment of chronic anxiety. When fear becomes the dominant currency, relationships are built on leverage rather than trust. You influence others by triggering their insecurities. You maintain order by highlighting consequences. You cultivate loyalty through intimidation rather than respect. On the surface, compliance increases. Beneath the surface, resentment grows. Fear may produce obedience, but it cannot produce devotion. It may silence voices, but it cannot secure hearts. Educationally, fear activates the brain. at amygdala, intensifying threat perception and diminishing rational processing. Prolonged activation reduces creativity and impairs empathy. A fearful mind struggles to imagine positive outcomes. It anticipates betrayal more easily than cooperation. Darkness exploits this neurological vulnerability. When individuals remain in heightened anxiety, they are easier to manipulate. They seek strong figures who promise protection. They cling to systems that appear stable, even if those systems are oppressive. Fear also distorts identity. It convinces you that you are constantly at risk. It persuades you that others are inherently adversarial. It reshapes memory, highlighting negative experiences while minimizing positive ones. Over time, you begin to interpret the world through a lens of suspicion. This lens reinforces isolation. Isolation intensifies insecurity. Insecurity strengthens the need for control. And control without peace returns to bondage. There is a quiet suspense in recognizing how subtle this transformation can be. A person rarely decides to live in fear. It accumulates gradually. A betrayal here, a failure there, a loss that was never processed. Each event deposits a layer of caution. Caution, when unexamined, becomes distrust. Distrust, when normalized, becomes fear. And fear, when empowered, governs behavior. The individual may not realize that their decisions are motivated by avoidance rather than conviction. Calm strength emerges when fear is confronted rather than obeyed. Confronting fear requires stillness. It requires acknowledging vulnerability without immediately compensating for it. This is difficult because vulnerability feels like weakness to a mind accustomed to control. Yet it is in this acknowledgement that peace begins to return. Peace slows the internal alarm. It allows reason to re-engage. It creates space for reflection instead of reaction. When peace replaces fear as the internal currency, relationships change. Influence shifts from intimidation to inspiration. Authority becomes service rather than dominance. Decisions reflect long-term vision rather than immediate protection. The body relaxes, the mind quiets, sleep deepens. The constant scanning for threat diminishes. This transformation may not be dramatic outwardly, but internally it is profound. The most sobering realization is that many who appear powerful are negotiating daily with fear. Their schedules are full, yet their hearts are restless. Their voices are strong, yet their thoughts are anxious. They expand their influence hoping it will silence insecurity, but expansion without peace only magnifies the instability. Until fear loses its authority, bondage persists quietly beneath visible success. And until peace becomes the foundation of power, strength will remain fragile, always one threat away from collapse. As we come to the end of this testimony, let us return to the quiet truth woven through every word. Power without peace is bondage. Fear is the currency of darkness. Authority belongs to the one whose name brings light. And encounter changes what argument never could. What appeared strong was fragile. What seemed hidden was exposed. What felt permanent was broken in a single moment of surrender. The journey from darkness to light is not loud. It is not always dramatic in appearance. It is often calm, deliberate, deeply personal, but it is powerful. Because when peace replaces fear and love replaces control, a person is no longer enslaved by what once defined them. The chains may have been invisible, but so is freedom when it first arrives. You feel it in the quiet. You sense it in the stillness. You recognize it in the absence of fear. If this testimony has spoken to you, if it has stirred something within your heart, I want to sincerely thank you for taking the time to watch and reflect. Your presence here means more than you know. These stories are not just told to be heard, they are shared to bring hope, clarity, and light. Thank you truly for watching this video. If you found value in this message, please consider subscribing to the channel. Stay connected so you don't miss future testimonies and teachings that continue to explore truth in a calm and reflective way. There is more to uncover, more to learn, more light to walk in. Stay connected, stay reflective, and above all, choose peace over fear.